The question that needs to be answered by a number of companies right now is, why is it okay for 50 end-to-end tests fail every night, but it's not okay for one unit test to fail in a run? Why are we setting the bar so low for end-to-end tests and saying it's totally fine if these 25 tests fail? That's okay. We still have confidence in our product. That tells me, no, you do not. If more companies put automation tests into their CI/CD pipeline, you wouldn't see this sort of behavior any longer, because it acts as a hard quality gate against bad code and would provide a higher level of urgency to fix these tests.
Welcome to the / where we lean into the future of IT. I'm Aaron Chesney with my beautiful co-host, James Carman. Today, we're going to be talking about testing automation, and we have a special guest with us, Jonathan Thompson. Jonathan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I got my start in software about 7 years ago, and to really go back, my engineering career started in 2009. I enlisted in the United States Air Force, and I became a avionics engineer. I was working on guidance and navigation controls for C-130H2 aircraft. I got deployed and found these pamphlets on Middle Eastern culture, and just fell in love with the idea of learning about the topic of anthropology. So I went back to college and started a degree in anthropology, ended up pivoting to history, and became a wing historian. But wing historian and an archaeologist, if you'd believe it. I worked as an archaeologist for 3 years. It doesn't pay well. So I quickly realized that the benefits of being a historian specializing in Chinese history in the United States probably doesn't translate too well to a good positive career. So I ended up pivoting to quality assurance management at a medical device company where I worked for 3 years. My wife came home one day and she noticed that I was particularly down because my job was stressful and long hours, and I had a difficult CEO at the time. And she said, I've been hearing about this coding boot camp at work. She specifically works at Northwestern University. She said, I've been hearing about this coding boot camp. They just pushed through their first cohort. Would you mind taking a look at it? Tell me if you would appreciate that, because you love computers. You love working with computers. So I said, sure, I'll take a look at it. It would require me to go back to school for nights and weekends, which working full time was difficult, but we made it work. And so I decided, all right, let's do this. And so I did this coding boot camp for 6 months, graduated in October of 2016, and I got my first software gig in December of 2016 at Vidori Inc. in Chicago. They're a 50-person marketing firm, and I was working as a software quality assurance specialist. So how I got into automation is I used Selenium WebDriver to crawl websites for a module during this coding boot camp. And I thought, wow, this is really neat. I get to tell the computer what to do, and it just goes ahead and does it. That's outrageous to me. So I wanted to learn more about Selenium and found that it was most popularly used in automation testing. And I had never heard of automation testing before, so I decided to start looking into that and testing out different types of frameworks. One of my favorites was Tape with JavaScript. So I was using Tape testing framework with Selenium WebDriver 3 to test out the specific modules that I created in this bootcamp. And actually, as my capstone project, I created an accession software for museums and made sure to include an automation suite that ran through how to accession a product, how to archive it, and all the other fun stuff. So Vidori gave me this opportunity to become a quality assurance specialist that worked in automation, and they introduced me to Ruby and Water. Water is a automation framework using Ruby and Selenium under the hood. So we used that for a few years, and Cypress got released. And I noticed very early on, Cypress sounds outrageous, right? Especially in 2017, like this is brand new, this is revolutionary. So I decided to start latching onto it quite a bit and learning the ins and outs of the framework. And I've pretty much staked my flag in understanding Cypress and how it works. And I have brought it to numerous companies over the last few years. So I left Fedora after 2 years, started working at Transloc, and that was where I built my first automation WebDriver. It was a WebDriver built on Selenium 3 with parts of Water, Splinter, and Cypress included, and it was ready to be open sourced before we decided to go back to Cypress. So since then, I've just been working with Cypress and Playwright in my my current roles, and right now I'm a test automation engineer at Caliberty.
So, since you've been to boot camp twice, which one was harder, the coding boot camp or the Air Force boot camp?
Come on, it's Air Force. You know the answer to that.
Right. It's obviously the coding one, right?
The coding was harder. The coding was harder. Yeah. I've got to tell you, the air conditioning was better in the coding boot camp, and they definitely had more Diet Coke. So that was a big thing. Yeah. Air Force Boot Camp was interesting. I really enjoyed it. It was different for me because I entered the military at the age of 24. So I was around a bunch of 18-year-olds that didn't really understand like what life was presenting, what life was bringing to them. And actually, it was pretty funny to me. I had to teach a few of them how to do laundry because they had absolutely no idea how to work a laundry machine, which to me was like mind blowing, right? Like I've been doing this since I was 14 years old, but some people out there just don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely a failed test.
Aaron, I just find it uncanny, don't you? That like, the people we talk to, the background, it's almost cookie cutter. Boy joins Air Force, boy becomes avionics engineer, boy becomes archaeologist, boy becomes historian, boy becomes QA manager. You know what I mean? Like it just follows the exact same arc.
Story as old as time.
The story as old. It is. It really is. I mean, you see this. If I had a nickel, you know what I mean?
Right. It's one of the original plot lines, isn't it? Like,
I'm sure that you guys encounter many archaeologists in our career field, for sure.
So when you're doing archaeology, do you carry a bullwhip with you just in case?
It's a funny story and a bit embarrassing. I met my wife dressed as Indiana Jones, and she was dressed as Indiana Jones. So it was love at first sight. Is what it was.
That's fantastic.
Kind of a love of self. Yeah.
Yeah.
So were you an archaeologist after you got out of the Air Force, or while you were in the Air Force?
No, I was an archaeologist during my time in the Air Force. So I spent 5 years as an avionics engineer and then 3 years as the, if you'd believe it, lowest ranking and youngest wing historian in, as far as I know, Air Force history. I was a senior airman, which is an E4, and they usually don't provide wing historian jobs to individuals that are not staff sergeants or above. So it was like a special little exception for me, which I thought was pretty outrageous. And during this time, I was working as an archaeologist. My specific title was site supervising archaeologist on the Castle Kampf historical site in Parma, New York. So it was a fun little ride. Yeah, we were digging up 19th century antiquities. It was pretty much 19th century early American settlement. But we got to learn quite a bit about the Castle Kampf family and what they consumed, right? We knew that they had decent types of jewelry because we dug up a gold ring that was emblazoned with JFC, which was outrageous. That was one of our first finds in our first year. And then since then, we had dug up oyster shells, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with upstate New York, but on the Erie Canal, they would bring seafood from the coast down to Rochester, Buffalo areas. And these farmers must have been well-to-do because they were purchasing oysters. So They had some kind of monetary means to them.
That's crazy. I didn't even know that you could be an archaeologist in the Air Force. That blows my mind.
You know, a lot of people don't know that the Air Force enlists historians, that the Army enlists archaeologists, that the Navy has underwater archaeologists. So it's kind of a niche field, but it's a special one, and it's critical to the Air Force infrastructure.
Huh. Learn something new every day. So, I don't know how we're going to tie this into testing. What was the last artifact software that you dug up?
You know, I've been working with my client for a few months now, and we use Postman for API tests. But you speak of an artifact, and this is one where it's almost a deprecated framework. And this client has been pushing for Postman to be removed due to regulatory needs, and I've been pushing for us to use Playwright as an automation solution. If you didn't know, Playwright is not just an end-to-end test runner, but it can also be used as an API test runner. So when I look at my days as an archaeologist and my days as an automation engineer, a lot of the time I'm looking at what I would consider to be, or what we could consider to be, deprecated frameworks, right? Older frameworks that are potentially brittle. And you dig these up and you understand the inner workings of them and why they were purposeful or why they were rational at the time. And then you take the best parts of them and implement that into your next solution. So case in point, I worked at Transloc for a bit, and they had a Ruby framework that ran its tests in 2 hours. Now, if we're going to be talking about running these tests in CI/CD and making sure that you have quality gates, you can't have tests running for 2 hours, right? No one's going to sit there. A developer is not going to sit there, hit the button, and then walk away for 2 hours and wait for the test to complete. So I saw what was going on. The tests weren't being parallelized, and decided, okay, we can redo this, but with parallelization. And what I mean by parallelization is really exploiting the total number of cores that your computer or processor has, and ensuring that one test is divvied to each core so that they run consecutively. Cuts down on automation time. So took this 2-hour pipeline, cut it down to 10 minutes, and that's a much easier pill to swallow when you're working in high stress environments or high tempo environments, right? You can just push that commit, come back in 10 minutes, and there you go. You've got your tests.
And without doing that extra work, what you end up doing is then delaying your run of tests until when it's convenient, which gives you a larger change set, which it includes, the possibility of breaking more often. So, like the 2-hour run. Well, we can't do that during working hours, so we're going to run that on a nightly basis instead. And then it's something that has to be checked on the side every morning. It gets overlooked sometimes. Oh, it always runs red. Well, why is it running red? You miss things, and then it code rot starts to fester because of it. So doing things like making sure that the tests run in a short amount of time frame actually does help with maintaining every time you build, you test in it goes in that order: build, test, deploy, right? Then test again after your deploy. And it's just,
I'm glad that you bring up code rot, because you see that so frequently. Granted, I've only been doing this for 7 years, but I feel like most clients that I've been a part of have had some level of code rot, whether it was 25%, 50%. Tests are in the red, and there's this constant narrative of our tests are failing, we can't trust them, what can we do? Now, I learned from Angie Jones very early on that you should never trust a test that you haven't seen fail, right? So it's good that we've seen it fail. This is positive. The issue is that what I consider to be the crux of automation testing, right? The purpose of automation is providing highly configurable feedback to your developers to showcase that, okay, you worked on this feature, it is not broken, right? So when you have tests that are failing all the time, what we would consider a brittle test or a flaky test, it doesn't provide that feedback. It doesn't provide that trust to the developer. And that's something that you need to rectify very quickly.
Producer.
What's going on? Oh, I meant to type these up, and then I was going to have you guys say them.
Oh, I thought you wanted to drop in. Okay, so do you want to type them and then we'll ask them as we go, or do you want, now that you've interrupted everything, Mr. Producer?
Yeah, I mean, I might as well, right? I was going to ask what your take is, Jonathan, on the trend lately of teams not having QA resources or QA automation resources, and like developers can do all the testing.
Yeah,
right? Like it'd be interesting to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I actually, so during my career, I worked as a software engineer for 2 years, and I was specifically a back-end engineer. I got to work with a lot of quality tools. I implemented linting using Golang CI-lint, and created some CI/CD gates to ensure quality as a software engineer. But one of the things that I was tasked with doing was an initiative called DevOwn's Test, where quality was pulled away from the team and the developers themselves would own testing. Now, I think that it was both successful and unsuccessful, because your developers, while they are brilliant individuals, may not have the correct mindset, if you will, for testing, right? Because having been on both sides of the fence, you go from a builder to a breaker and a breaker to a builder. And it takes a different level of context for both of these jobs. So it was difficult at the start to really get buy-in from my fellow developers on my team, right? Because I was tasked with this initiative. My manager at the time really pushed for it, really wanted it, because our QA was trying to make their way into software engineering. And so the writing was on the wall. We're going to lose QA, so developers need to test. I think that it was unsuccessful because we as developers never wrote automation. We wrote unit and integration tests. So the bottom layer of the automation triangle, pyramid, but we never got to the point that we were writing end-to-end tests, right? So I think that was a specific failure. Where it was successful was the fact that it helped reduce the typical animosity, if you will, between quality assurance and software engineering, right? Because there tends to be in shops where development works on the feature and then pitches it over to QA, there tends to be a little bit of tension between the two parties.
Or a lot.
Or a lot, yes. I'm trying to sugarcoat it right now. But yes, there can be tension between the two parties, and it can turn into a relationship that has some level of animosity. So I do feel that the initiative was successful in toning that down a bit, because we saw developers take ownership of the testing pipeline and realize what it is to test a product rather than just build it. Now, I don't feel that shops out there should not have quality assurance. And I'm biased because I am quality assurance. But I do not think that shops out there should not have a QA engineer attached.
So there's a couple things I want to dissect there. One, just for the listeners that may not be aware, the testing pyramid is a few different layers, where the bottom base of your pyramid is your unit test, and that the next layer up is more your end-to-end integration type tests, and then like the tip of your pyramid is your full end-to-end black box testing of your system, but all automated. So it's an automated testing pyramid. So I just wanted to explain that a little bit, because you did mention the testing pyramid in that last bit. And then the other thing is that not only do I feel like there should be more of a blurring of the lines between QA and dev. I usually insist on it because if you're working in a small team that doesn't have that QA resource, that responsibility falls to you as a developer. If you do, and if you are the QA person responsible for automation on a team, you need to be managing your tests like developers manage their code. So I do think that there's this crossover and blend, and I've had this conversation with a QA engineer that was on my team once. It's like, you need to be as good of a coder as my developers, and the reason is that if you write unmaintainable, unreadable, and sloppy tests, they're no better than if I was writing code the same way, and that has to be maintainable. Because when a test breaks and you're not here to do it, somebody else has to go in and look at your test, understand what's going on, and be able to fix it. Because tests break just like code breaks, just you have a lot more visibility to it, especially when you're automating. And with automation, you're also looking at trying to get, we talked about parallelizing tests in order to make them run faster. In order to do that successfully, you have to have what I like to call a net zero test, which means like your entry point for that test has to come all the way back around to where it started from. So your start and finish line are at the same point on the track. Right.
I call those hermetically sealed tests. And what I mean by hermetically sealed is its outcome or artifacts cannot affect other tests in the run, right? So this is accomplished by proper setup, teardown, and artifact creation. I personally like to use libraries like Faker, Factory Boy, and other such means to ensure that my test data does not create what we call collisions or contamination, right? When I create a test artifact, say I'm working in a transit application and I create a rider, right? I need to make sure that this rider is 100% unique, 2, never going to contaminate another test, right? So how do I do that? I set it up prior to the test. I make sure that it's unique with either a Faker timestamp or a Zulu string, something along those lines. And then afterward, during teardown, I delete it or archive it so that it's gone and it cannot affect any other tests.
And the other part of that too is you also need to make sure that your tests do not rely on each other in the order in which they run. They have to be able to run independently of the entire test suite.
Yes, and that actually brings up I have a conflicting opinion here than a lot of other testers out there. But I personally believe, and again, this is my own personal opinion, that the days of true end-to-end testing are over. I think the days of true end-to-end testing are over. And what I mean by end-to-end testing is running from point A to point C and testing point B as the middleman, right? It doesn't happen as frequently any longer, and you see more frameworks, Selenium 4, Playwright, Test Cafe, Cypress, they all have means of mocking, stubbing, or spoofing data, spoofing endpoints, to ensure that you have what I would consider an hermetically sealed test. So the idea of an end-to-end test where you are testing against prod endpoints, making sure that the entire pipeline works constructively and consecutively, it doesn't happen as frequently anymore. At least in my experience, it doesn't. Instead, what we're doing is more so feature testing with constrained mocks and spoofs.
And I think part of the reason you see that is because the data layer integrations to modern software have basically become so boilerplate in that you don't have developers in there writing their own SQL as much anymore. There's this binding to the software that it's almost taken for granted that my data layer works. I know that, right? And that's kind of the way it ends up running.
I really like this question on the ideal split in testing responsibilities with request to the testing pyramid. Should quality assurance engineers only be responsible for the top part? I say no. I think in an ideal world, I less consider myself a QA engineer and more consider myself an SDET now, a software development engineer and test. When I consider an SDET and what they bring to the team, I've had positions where I've asked my developers, show me your unit tests, show me your integration tests, put me on the PR so that I can see what you're doing and verify that we are testing the right things. Now, there are some out there that may consider that overbearing, but again, I've got to tell you, I've been on both sides of the coin, right? I've written unit and integration tests. I've written end-to-end tests. If I want to make sure that we are writing high fidelity tests and high fidelity code, I think it just makes sense that quality is involved in the unit and integration tests. There have been plenty of times as a developer, because I had the testing eye, if you will, I would look at a PR and say, well, wait a second, what about this? What about this edge case? Is that something that we can program in a unit test? Is that something that we can do in an integration test? We would catch it, put it in, boop, there we go. And that's, I feel like that occurs because you have a specialist that is trained to test.
Yeah, and that goes back to that cross training, right? When you have a QA engineer on your team that's involved at that level, the cross training happens more naturally, right? You've got your developers that are getting the input from their QA engineer, and the QA engineers in their code seeing how they do stuff, and will naturally kind of glean, oh, I see how they structure this. This is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And be able to pick up things. So, or, those conversations happen through that PR process of getting, the feedback in that loop kind of closes to where your developers understand more of the QA mindset, so they make less and less of those errors, and QA understands kind of the developer's mental process of structuring and mocking and things like that to improve his own test creation and structuring of a test suite.
I think it also bridges the divide between quality and development, right? Because, there's no better way for me to phrase this without it coming off as pejoratively, but there is a stigma that quality assurance engineers can come off as helpless at times, right? Developers need to do things for them. We need to set deployments. We need to refactor code. We need to implement data IDs for end-to-end tests because the QA engineer can't do it or won't do it or don't know how to do it, right? So working with the developers to truly understand the code, right? Maybe do some white box testing instead of black box all the time could, and in my experience has, allowed me to get a better understanding of the development pipeline, better understanding of the feature and product. So instead of bothering the developer, hey, we need data IDs on this feature, can you go ahead and put them in? No, I'll just go ahead and do it, right? I know where this feature lives. I know where this component is. I'm gonna put this in programmatically, deploy it, make sure that it works. There we go. I'm done. Now, to me, that is an expression of QA agency, developer agency, right? I have the ability to do this. It's just that we don't have a lot of shops right now that are really trying to engage in that bridge between QA and development. They're trying to keep them statically separated.
And a lot of times they'll do that through the build process. To come back around on that, in your CI/CD pipeline, they won't include running the automation suites. They're like, oh, that's separate. So we run that separate. And I think that's a big problem. Because for one, you want your QA accountable for the stuff that they're creating to make sure that it's always running in green, just like you would the developer's code. And you want to keep the developers on their toes, because if they fail in automation, they need to go back and find out why and correct that before they merge that into their main branch and have that filter its way to production, become a very costly thing that has to be fixed down the line.
Right. The question that needs to be answered by a number of companies right now is, why is it okay for 50 end-to-end tests fail every night, but it's not okay for one unit test to fail in a run. Why is that acceptable? Why are we setting the bar so low for end-to-end tests and saying it's totally fine if these 25 tests fail? That's okay. We still have confidence in our product. That tells me, no, you do not. Your tests are failing, right? We need to fix that. And sure, brittle tests, flaky, something or other. There's an excuse for why it's occurring. Well, I can tell you right now, you can shore it up with mocks, you can shore it up with spoofs, you can shore it up with stubs, or just better tests, right? If you're using what I call dumb waits, waiting on specific times, 10 seconds, wait on an endpoint instead, wait on a route to fire, intercept a route. You can do it with Selenium 4 now. You've been able to do it for 3 years. So, that to me is the biggest burning question in quality. Why is it acceptable that these end-to-end tests can fail routinely? And I got to be honest with you, I think that if more companies put automation tests, if more companies put end-to-end tests into their CI/CD pipeline, you wouldn't see this sort of behavior any longer, because it acts as a hard quality gate against what is considered bad code, right? And bad code is failing tests. So if we saw more automation in CI/CD, it would prevent more pushes from getting through, more commits to main, right? And would provide a higher level of urgency to fix these tests. Because I've worked in environments where we've had a test failing for a month, and that's entirely too long.
I've been in shops too where, this test always fails, so we're just going to ignore it so that we can get out the door.
One of my favorite experiences, and this was 2 years into my career. One of my favorite experiences, I was working with a senior engineer, and I asked him, how are we going to fix this test? And he comments it out. I said, okay. is that how we do this?
That's the technology equivalent of when the check engine light comes on, you get a piece of electrical tape and you put it over top of it.
Yeah.
No problem.
Pull the
Not
fuse.
a problem. Yeah. Not a problem anymore. So one of the things that we struggle with in software engineering in general is how much is enough when it comes to testing. How do you come up with that determination of what level is enough?
Right. And it's difficult with end-to-end testing because we don't have this idea of code coverage, right? We don't have this nebulous idea of code coverage that you see with unit and integration tests. You can run a tool with your unit tests and make sure that, okay, this function has been tested to whatever your threshold is. At one of my clients, it was 80%, right? 80% of this function has been tested properly. There we go. As far as I'm concerned, if you are able to get the happy path through the door, right? Get the happy path through the door, and then start working on very common edge cases, right? So if we were to look at a user registration form and we have an email input and someone tries to put in a string that is not an email regex, right? Should we have an automation test for that? I think so. Yeah. I think that it makes some sense because that is a real life scenario where something could go wrong. But are we going to have a automation test for what if this form returns a 400 bad request or like a something or other? I think that could be done at the unit or integration layer, right? So we get our happy path done, we get some edge cases, and I think that that's typically going to be good enough. Where it comes, where there is fuzziness is when you found a fault or a bug and you want to address that through automation. I personally err towards addressing bugs or faults in unit and integration layer rather than the end-to-end layer.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. In one of the criteria I use, if it's something a stakeholder would care about, so if you're showing this to a product owner or hire, and it would be something that you would demo to them because they care about it, then it should probably be in your automation test suite.
Yes.
The other thing I've done for this is for larger applications, I've used something that I call a user flow map. And basically taking an application and saying, okay, yeah, the user can go this way, and then they have these choices, and then if they go this way, they can do these choices. You get kind of like this branching. It almost like looks like a reverse tournament bracket type of thing, and then you can route those paths through the system, and you can say, okay, yes, I have a test for that, I have a test for that, and as you color in the map, you know that you've got all of your happy paths marked out in the system, so that you know where your test suite needs to be. And sometimes that can be a very large and daunting task when you have a large application, like a certain math project that James and I had the pleasure of working on, right? There's a lot of different options and a lot of different paths, and uh, in being able to traverse those in typically the automation tools are great at being able to do that. Like Selenium's a perfect example of, it can go through, it can click and make those decisions, and you can verify some of those things that are output. Sometimes it struggles with getting certain outputs because they're behind like JavaScript or something like that, or they're using like a canvas. You can't verify things on a canvas easily in that type of thing. But for the most part, you can say, okay, yeah, well, we did get a canvas, so let's hope they've got the testing in there to cover that. And there may be tools now that would be able to do that kind of thing. So that's what I've used to ensure that we did get a good amount of testing within an application, is to use that kind of a map. And you may have seen some of my user flow maps, James, from that project.
Absolutely. So one of the things that, the way I think about testing is, it's risk mitigation ultimately, right? So you identify, here are some areas where we could have some risk of fault, right? Some issues, and you got to use the right test for the right type of risk that you're trying to mitigate, right? For me, like business logic and stuff like that, all of that should be done down in the unit test to make sure that we are actually executing the correct logic, right? I don't want to use end-to-end tests for that. It seems like a pretty heavyweight thing to make sure I'm doing the right logical thing for my code is executing in the right logical steps or whatever. But you talked about like end-to-end testing that it's kind of dead, and to an extent I agree. We may not agree with how we're killing it, but I think I definitely agree. I don't like end-to-end tests. I want to minimize the use of them. But the one thing that they are good at is making sure that those interconnections between the steps along the way from one end to the other end, that all of those binary interconnections between different systems are working properly. So how do you address that in the mock situation? When you mock things, you're just making an assumption about, well, what is this interconnection? How does it actually work? What's the contract, so to speak, right? How do you mitigate that risk that I made a crappy assumption when I made my mock?
Yeah. So Cypress came out with the component test runner a few years ago, and I feel like that really put into perspective that end-to-end testing is cumbersome, and instead we should be focusing on feature or component tests with our automation, right? So how do we test this component in situ, if you will, to use archaeological terms? How do we test it in place? And what I would argue is that you would use mocks and stubs to perform that, and then rely on integration and unit layer to ensure that everything is hooked up behind the scenes. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have one quote all-encompassing happy path test. In the example of having a user registration, I think that it would be worthwhile to have one test that runs through the entire pipeline, and then other tests along the way that would test things like null entry for specific values, like last name, first name, trying to click the submit button 10 different times, something along those lines, or trying to submit without accepting terms of service or terms of agreement. What we could also potentially do is component tests where if we know that our user registration model is going to be sending off to an endpoint once submit is kicked off, and we know that it will return, say, an error page if the submission fails, we could mock that API to return a 400 bad request or a 401 unauthorized and ensure that that error condition comes up instead of having to wait for, say, an outage or something along those lines to be able to test that end to end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it maybe enlighten us because you use the term component test. So what is a component in your mind?
To me, a component is similar to, say, a page or a specific development feature, right? So the way that we can look at it is page object modeling, right? You have your page and you have your objects that live within the page. So in this sense, the component would be the user registration page and whatever is entailed in it: the first name, the last name, the email, the submission button, those sorts of things. How does the component interact with other pages? What sort of endpoints are associated with it? And how can we best test this while also providing a high level of fidelity and value to the company?
You mentioned like mocking out like API services from the back end. And yes, I agree with that. That's a great way to test the front end functionality. The problem, I guess, is that that's not being addressed. Is you're mocking out a response. Let's say it's a JSON structure, it's a status code, and all of those things, right? How do you know that you got the shape right of that JSON response? How do you know that the API actually does return 40 whatever in that case?
Yeah, I feel like that could come down to your integration tests or schema checks, right? I will be honest with you. I've never worked for a client that didn't have some level of API testing using Postman or Insomnia, just to double check things. And it's very common that you'll have pre-request and post-request scripts to double check schema and ensure that things are operating properly at the JSON level. Plus, Postman tests are fairly cheap, right? I mean, let's be honest. You run Newman, it kicks off, it's done in about 10 seconds. And you have high fidelity, high value tests provided to your company. I'm not sure if I would say that we could do that. Like, we can do that, right? Playwright can do it. Cypress can do it. Selenium 4 can now do it. Whether it's worthwhile or not from an end-to-end perspective is a different story. Because if we're, again, to look at the testing period, end-to-end is at the top of the pyramid. And these should be high value, very high expensive tests because they take a long period of time to run. Whereas, say, writing up a simple Postman test using either Postman's built-in test runner or Newman, that'll take 5 minutes, something around there, right? Hit the endpoint, double check the schema. There we go.
Yeah, and so I kind of want to add into that too, is that you have this idea of contracts, because in modern architectures you don't have the monolith system that is the all-encompassing back end with a front end face on it, to where you need to do all this end-to-end testing. You have these seams between layers that have contracts in between them. So you have maybe a service that's reliant on a downstream service, and there's a contract between those two that creates a testing seam. So if you're testing that seam from both ends, so when I make this call, I'm expecting to get this, and if I get that, I'm able to process it. And you do that as a mock, and then you open it up and go, okay, both of these are deployed. I'm going to run this test and allow it to hit that other service. Then you get that A plus B equals C, B plus C equals, hang on, how does that go? A plus C, basically the Venn diagram where they overlap.
Yeah.
Right? So you get you that's what it is. If A plus C equals B and C plus B equals A, then A plus C equals B or whatever.
I think we're on the right
something
track.
like that.
I think it's unfortunate we don't have video attached to this, because watching Aaron's brain just fry trying to figure this out as he's this is hilarious.
I had it right while he was talking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, because mathematically speaking, I have to write it out. It's an identity.
I do want to point out I'm not advocating for using mocks to replace integration tests or unit tests, right? Like I'm not.
Right.
That's not what I want to see. I don't want to see a company listen to this podcast and say, well, Jonathan said end-to-end tests are dead, so we're just going to mock everything and throw our hands up and say that's it, right? I feel that this type of testing occurs when you have solid unit and integration tests in place, right? When your developers of quality assurance have built up the infrastructure to create integration tests to make sure that those pipelines are certainly verified, right? Because at that point, you're creating a duality, if you will, right? Why are you testing the same thing again in your end-to-end test when it's already been tested at the integration layer? That to me is cause for we can mock this out because it's already crossed off.
Do you consider yourself to be a developer or a test automation engineer?
It's a great question. I consider myself to be a developer. The title that I personally like to use is software development engineer and test. My biggest quandary with being in quality assurance was I came out of this boot camp. I had a certification in full stack web development. I've built 20 or 30 separate apps, right? I'm more than a quality assurance engineer. And I think that I struggled with that for the first 5 years of my career was I'm more than just a tester. And yet it was difficult to be seen as more than just a tester. So when I got to a client who looked at my code and said, you write good code, become a developer, and then they allowed me to do so, they gave me that opportunity, I jumped on it. And ever since then, I can tell you, why did I come back to QA? I love it. I love the frameworks. I love the tools. I love the rush of finding a bug or a fault and not coming to the developer and saying, your stuff is broken, but instead saying, we have a problem. Let's fix it. Let's tackle this, right? That's a dopamine hit. That is a big hit. And I tell you what, I mean, I've built and I've broken software. I think when you find a good bug and you come up with a solid solution in a collaborative environment, there's nothing that hits that. There's nothing that hits just right like that. So at the end of the day, I consider myself a software developer who specializes in automation testing. That's to me my title. That's what I like to consider myself because like I've said, I've done both. I've enjoyed them both, but testing is my niche. Testing is my natural fit.
So we have this thing that we do that we call lightning round. And these are very important questions. We get to the real heart of, what it means to be human, and the real big problems in society, and very, very deep topics. And there are absolutely wrong answers. So I'm just forewarning you.
Good to know.
Yeah. So I just wanted to set the tone of this. We don't want to deal with levity here. This is very serious now. When we get into this lightning round, it's very serious. So I'd like to start off just to make sure we level set you on what this looks like. First question. Fill in the blank. Taylor Swift is
powerful. She is powerful. I gotta love her.
And we don't allow any elaboration.
Gotcha.
Unless it's from us. I don't make up the rules. Except, I just did, but yeah. Go ahead.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at wiffle ball?
Terrible. A 1. 1 on wiffle ball. Could you? Are you writing these down, Aaron? We will be tallying up the score. Have you ever worn socks with sandals?
I have not.
Have you ever tasted soap?
Yes. Yeah, that was a bad day.
All right, say "good day, mate" in an Australian accent.
G'day, mate.
Not bad, not bad. All right, he's our second best at that.
What's your favorite clothing brand?
Favorite clothing brand? I'd have to say, gosh, Old Navy is up there right now.
How long can you hold your breath?
Probably 2 minutes.
2 minutes. That's above average, honestly, based on our empirical evidence of this show. So,
Give me a word that starts with the letter Q.
Quincy.
No, sorry.
Do we allow proper nouns?
Quality was what we were looking for there.
Can it be quixotic? Let's go with quixotic.
Oh, nice. Most embarrassing store you might be seen shopping at.
I if they had a store that peddled specifically clothes for dogs, you'd find me in it. I would be buying something, a sweater for my 90-pound golden doodle to see if it would fit him.
Which leads into our final question, big dogs or small dogs?
Big dogs, 100% of the time.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. That is the correct answer.
So I think we've pretty much covered all of the what it is to be human with this round of questioning. Do you think, Aaron, have we pretty much covered everything?
Yes, I think so. I think we are ready to wrap up the day. Thank you to our special guest, Jonathan Thompson, and my beautiful co-host, James Carmen, and all of our staff that puts our episodes together. Stay tuned for our next episode where we'll be talking about something IT related on the /.